I always thought my life was perfect, not in a naive fairy tale kind of way, but in the way that comes from years of hard work, love, and dedication. My name is Daniel Harper, and I'm a 38-year-old architect living in Chicago. My wife Emily and I had been married for 12 years. We met in college, two kids from small towns chasing big dreams. She was studying journalism, and I was knee-deep in blueprints and models. We were different, but somehow we fit. She was my best friend, my confidant, my everything. Our life was a blend of routine and spontaneity. Weekdays were filled with work, dinners, and late-night conversations. Weekends were for exploring the city, trying new restaurants, or just staying in, wrapped in each other's company. We had a beautiful home in the suburbs, a golden retriever named Max, and plans for the future. We were trying for a baby, though it hadn't happened yet. But we were hopeful, always hopeful. Emily was my rock. She had this way of making everything seem okay even when it wasn't. Her smile could light up a room, and her laugh was infectious. She was the kind of person who could strike up a conversation with anyone, and within minutes, they'd be sharing their life story. I loved that about her. I loved everything about her. But then, things started to change. It was subtle at first. She'd come home late from work, blaming it on deadlines. Her phone, which used to sit casually on the kitchen counter, was now always in her pocket or face down on the table. She'd get texts at odd hours, and when I asked who it was, she'd brush it off with a vague, "Oh, just work stuff." I told myself I was being paranoid. Emily loved me. She wouldn't betray me, but the nagging feeling in my gut wouldn't go away. It was like a splinter, small but impossible to ignore. One night, I decided to trust my instincts. Emily had gone out with her girlfriends, or so she said. I stayed home, pretending everything was normal. But as soon as she left, I grabbed my coat and followed her. I felt like a character in some bad detective movie, but I couldn't help myself. I needed to know. I tailed her car to a fancy hotel downtown. My heart sank as I watched her walk inside, her heels clicking against the pavement. I waited a few minutes, then followed. The lobby was bustling, but I spotted her almost immediately. She was standing by the elevators, talking to a man I didn't recognize. He was tall, well-dressed, and looked like he'd stepped out of a magazine. They were laughing, and then, as if in slow motion, he leaned in and kissed her. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. My vision blurred, and for a moment, I thought I might pass out. But I didn't. I stood there, frozen, as they got into the elevator together. I wanted to scream, to run after them, to demand an explanation, but I couldn't move. All I could do was stand there, my heart breaking into a million pieces. When I finally got home, I sat in the dark, waiting for her. Hours passed, and with each minute, my anger grew, but so did my sadness. How could she do this to us? To me? I thought about all the times we'd talked about our future, all the dreams we'd shared. Had it all been a lie? When she finally walked through the door, she was surprised to see me still up. "Dan, what are you doing?" she asked, her voice tinged with guilt. I looked at her, my eyes burning with tears. "I know, Emily," I said, my voice trembling. "I know about the hotel, about him." Her face went pale, and for a moment, she didn't say anything. Then she started to cry. "Dan, I'm so sorry. It just happened. I didn't mean for it to." "Stop," I interrupted, my voice cold. "Just stop. I don't want to hear your excuses." She tried to reach for me, but I stepped back. "Please, Dan, let's talk about this. We can fix it." But I didn't want to fix it. Not then. All I wanted was to hurt her the way she'd hurt me. And as I stood there, looking at the woman I once loved, I knew exactly what I had to do. The days that followed were a blur. Emily and I moved around each other like ghosts, our once warm and loving home now a cold, silent prison. She tried to talk to me, to explain, to apologize, but I shut her out. Every word she said felt like a dagger twisting in my chest. I couldn't bear to look at her, let alone listen to her excuses. I threw myself into work, staying late at the office and coming home only when I was sure she'd be asleep. But even work couldn't distract me from the storm raging inside me. I was angry, furious, but beneath the anger was a deep, aching sadness. I had loved Emily with everything I had, and she had thrown it all away. One night, as I sat alone in my office, staring at the city lights through the window, I made a decision. I wasn't going to let her destroy me. I wasn't going to be the broken, pitiful husband who just rolled over and accepted it. No, I was going to fight back. I was going to make her regret ever betraying me. But I wasn't going to do it impulsively. I wasn't going to stoop to her level. I was going to be smart, calculated. I was going to make her pay in a way that would leave her with nothing, no husband, no reputation, no future. The first step was to gather information. I needed to know everything about the man she'd been with. Who was he? What did he do? Why had she chosen him over me? I started digging, using every resource I had. It didn't take long to find out who he was. His name was Jonathan Carter. He was a successful real estate developer, wealthy, charismatic, and from what I could tell, a serial womanizer. He had a reputation for seducing married women, then moving on when he got bored. He was everything I wasn't, flashy, confident, and dangerous, and Emily had fallen for it. I felt a surge of disgust, not just for him, but for her. How could she be so naive, so foolish? Didn't she see that he was just using her, or did she not care? As I delved deeper into Jonathan's life, I discovered something interesting. He was in the middle of a major deal, a multi-million-dollar development project that was supposed to be his crowning achievement. But there were rumors of shady dealings, of bribes and backroom deals. If I could expose him, if I could bring him down, it would ruin him, and it would ruin Emily by association. But I needed proof. I needed something concrete, something that would stick. So I started watching him. I followed him to meetings, to restaurants, to his office. I took pictures, recorded conversations, and gathered as much information as I could. It was risky, but I didn't care. I was past caring. One night, as I was tailing him, I saw something that made my blood boil. He was meeting Emily at a secluded cafe. They sat close together, laughing and talking like they were the only two people in the world. I watched as he reached across the table and took her hand, and I felt a surge of rage so intense it nearly knocked me off my feet. But I didn't confront them, not yet. I needed to stay focused. I needed to stick to the plan. Over the next few weeks, I continued to gather evidence. I found out that Jonathan had been paying off city officials to fast-track his project. I discovered that he had a secret offshore account where he was stashing money. And I learned that he had a wife and kids who had no idea what he was really like. I felt a pang of guilt for his family, but it was quickly overshadowed by my determination. Jonathan had destroyed my marriage, and now I was going to destroy his life. But I wasn't just going to expose him. I was going to make sure Emily felt the full weight of what she'd done. I was going to make her see exactly what she'd thrown away. The more I uncovered about Jonathan, the more I realized how deep his corruption ran. He wasn't just a womanizer, he was a manipulator, a liar, and a cheat. His entire empire was built on deceit, and I was going to tear it down brick by brick. But I couldn't do it alone. I needed help. That's when I reached out to an old friend from college, Marcus. He was a journalist, one of the best investigative reporters in the business. If anyone could help me expose Jonathan, it was him. We met at a quiet bar downtown, away from prying eyes. Marcus listened intently as I laid out everything I'd discovered. His expression grew darker with each detail, and by the time I finished, he was shaking his head in disbelief. "This guy is a piece of work," Marcus said, sipping his whiskey. "But taking him down won't be easy. He's got connections, money, and a lot to lose. He's not going to go quietly." "I know," I replied, my voice steady. "But I've got evidence, and I've got nothing left to lose." Marcus studied me for a moment, then nodded. "All right, Dan, I'm in. But we need to be careful. One wrong move, and this could blow up in our faces." Over the next few weeks, Marcus and I worked tirelessly to build our case. We dug deeper into Jonathan's finances, his business dealings, and his personal life. We interviewed former employees, tracked down documents, and even managed to get a hold of some incriminating emails. It was risky, but every piece of evidence brought us one step closer to bringing him down. Meanwhile, life at home was a living nightmare. Emily and I were barely speaking, and when we did, it was only to argue. She begged me to forgive her, to give her another chance, but I couldn't. Not yet. Not until she understood the full extent of what she'd done. One night, after another heated argument, Emily finally broke down. "Why are you doing this, Dan?" she cried, tears streaming down her face. "Why can't you just let it go?" I looked at her, my heart heavy with a mix of anger and sadness. "Because you broke us, Emily. You broke everything we had, and I need you to understand what that means." She didn't respond. She just sat there, crying while I walked away. It hurt to see her like that, but I couldn't let myself feel sorry for her. Not yet. As the days turned into weeks, the tension between us grew unbearable, but I stayed focused on the plan. I knew that soon everything would come to a head, and when it did, I would be ready. Finally, the day arrived. Marcus and I had gathered enough evidence to expose Jonathan's corruption. We had documents, photos, and even a few witnesses willing to come forward. It was time to make our move. We scheduled a meeting with the editor of one of the largest newspapers in the city. We presented our case, laying out all the evidence we had collected. The editor was stunned. "This is huge," he said, his eyes wide. "If this gets out, it'll be the biggest scandal of the year." "That's the idea," I replied, a grim smile on my face. The story was set to run in the next day's paper. I knew that once it was out, there would be no turning back. Jonathan's life would be ruined, and Emily would be caught in the crossfire. But I didn't care, not anymore. That night, I went home and packed a bag. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay. Not with Emily. Not after everything that had happened. As I walked out the door, I took one last look at the life we had built together. The house, the photos on the walls, the memories we had shared. It was all gone now, destroyed by her betrayal. But I wasn't going to let it destroy me. I was going to start over, and I was going to make sure that Emily and Jonathan paid for what they had done. The morning the story broke, the city was in chaos. Jonathan Carter's face was plastered across the front page of every major newspaper, the headlines screaming about corruption, bribery, and scandal. His carefully constructed empire began to crumble within hours. Reporters camped outside his office, his home, even his favorite restaurants. His phone must have been ringing off the hook, but I doubted he was answering. I sat in a small diner across town, sipping coffee and watching the news on a muted TV. The anchor's face was serious, her lips moving rapidly as she recounted the details of the exposé. I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and emptiness. This was what I had wanted, wasn't it? To see Jonathan destroyed, to make him pay for what he'd done? But it didn't feel as good as I thought it would. My phone buzzed incessantly. Emily. She had called me at least a dozen times since the story broke. I ignored every call. I wasn't ready to talk to her, not yet. Finally, I turned off my phone and left the diner. I needed to clear my head. I walked aimlessly through the city, the crisp autumn air biting at my skin. The streets were alive with the usual hustle and bustle, but I felt detached from it all, like I was watching the world through a foggy window. By the time I got back to my car, I had made a decision. I needed to see Emily, not to reconcile, not to forgive, but to confront her, to make her understand the full weight of what she had done. When I pulled into the driveway, I saw her sitting on the front steps, her face pale and tear-streaked. She looked up as I approached, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and desperation. "Dan," she said, her voice trembling. "I didn't know. I swear I didn't know what he was doing. If I had—" "Stop," I interrupted, my voice cold. "This isn't about Jonathan. This is about you. About us." She flinched as if I had struck her. "I know I messed up, Dan. I know I hurt you. But please, can't we just talk about this? Can't we try to fix it?" I shook my head. "There's nothing left to fix, Emily. You broke it. You broke us." She started to cry again, her shoulders shaking with sobs. "I'm so sorry, Dan. I never meant to hurt you. I was lost. I didn't know what I was doing. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to take her in my arms and tell her everything would be okay. But I couldn't. The trust was gone, shattered beyond repair. You need to leave," I said, my voice steady. "I don't want you here anymore." She looked up at me, her eyes wide with shock. "What? Dan, this is my home too. You can't just—" "I can," I said, cutting her off. "And I will. You have until the end of the week to pack your things and get out." She stared at me, her mouth opening and closing as if she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. Finally, she nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Okay," she whispered, "if that's what you want." "It's not about what I want," I said, my voice softening slightly. "It's about what needs to be done." She didn't respond. She just sat there crying while I walked past her and into the house. I didn't look back. Over the next few days, Emily packed her things in silence. We barely spoke, and when we did, it was only about logistics. Who would keep the house? Who would take Max? How we would divide our assets. It was cold and clinical, a stark contrast to the life we had once shared. When the day finally came for her to leave, I stood in the doorway, watching as she loaded the last of her boxes into her car. She turned to me, her eyes red and swollen from crying. "I'm sorry, Dan," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "For everything." I nodded, but I didn't say anything. There was nothing left to say. She got into her car and drove away, leaving me standing there alone. I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. Relief that it was finally over, and sadness for what we had lost. But I didn't have time to dwell on it. I had a new life to build, and I wasn't going to let the past hold me back. The weeks that followed Emily's departure were a whirlwind of change. I threw myself into work, taking on new projects and pushing myself harder than ever before. It was my way of coping, of distracting myself from the emptiness that had settled in my chest. The house felt too big, too quiet without her. Even Max seemed to sense the shift, his usual exuberance replaced by a quiet, watchful demeanor. But I wasn't just working to distract myself. I was working to rebuild, to create something new out of the wreckage of my old life. I started by renovating the house, tearing down walls and repainting rooms, as if I could physically erase the memories that lingered in every corner. It was cathartic in a way, to see the old give way to the new. I also reconnected with friends I had neglected during my marriage. Marcus, in particular, became a constant presence in my life. He had been instrumental in bringing Jonathan down, and I owed him more than I could ever repay. We spent long nights at the bar, talking about everything and nothing, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I wasn't alone. But despite the progress I was making, there were still moments when the pain would hit me like a tidal wave. It usually happened when I least expected it, when I'd find one of Emily's hair ties in the couch cushions, or when I'd catch a whiff of her perfume in the hallway. Those moments were the hardest, when the memories would come rushing back, and I'd have to fight the urge to call her, to beg her to come back. But I never did. I couldn't. I had to keep moving forward. Meanwhile, Jonathan's life continued to unravel. The scandal had destroyed his reputation and his business was in shambles. He was facing multiple lawsuits and there were rumors of a criminal investigation. His wife had left him, taking their kids with her, and he had become a pariah in the city he once ruled. I should have felt triumphant, but I didn't. If anything, I felt a strange sense of pity for him. He had thrown away everything for the sake of his ego, and now he had nothing. It was a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happens when you let greed and selfishness consume you. As for Emily, I didn't know much about what had happened to her. She had moved into a small apartment downtown, and from what I heard, she was struggling to rebuild her life. She had lost her job at the magazine, apparently. Her involvement with Jonathan had made her a liability, and she was working as a freelance writer, barely scraping by. Part of me wanted to reach out to her, to make sure she was okay, but I couldn't. Not yet. I needed more time to heal, to figure out who I was without her. One evening, as I was sitting on the porch with Max, my phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "You free tonight?" There's something I want to talk to you about. I frowned. Marcus wasn't usually this cryptic. Sure, I replied. What's up? I'll tell you when I see you. Meet me at the usual spot at 8. I agreed, though I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. When I got to the bar, Marcus was already there, a serious expression on his face. What's going on? I asked as I sat down. He hesitated, then leaned in closer. I've been doing some digging, he said, his voice low, about Jonathan. I raised an eyebrow. I thought we were done with him. So did I, Marcus replied. But I found something big. He pulled out a folder and slid it across the table. I opened it, my eyes scanning the documents inside. As I read, my heart began to race. I trailed off, unable to find the words. Yeah, Marcus said, nodding. It's a game changer. The documents detailed a series of offshore accounts, shell companies, and illegal transactions. It was evidence of money laundering, tax evasion, and fraud on a massive scale. If this got out, Jonathan wouldn't just lose his business, he'd go to prison. I looked up at Marcus, my mind racing. What are you thinking? He leaned back in his chair, a sly smile on his face. I'm thinking we finish what we started. Marcus and I spent the next few days poring over the documents, cross-referencing dates, names, and amounts. The more we dug, the more we realized the extent of Jonathan's crimes. It wasn't just a few shady deals, it was a full-blown criminal enterprise. He had been laundering money for years, using his real estate projects as a front for illegal activities. The evidence was damning, but we needed to be careful. Jonathan was desperate, and desperate people do desperate things. We couldn't afford any mistakes. We need to take this to the authorities, Marcus said one evening as we sat in my living room surrounded by stacks of papers. But we need to do it quietly. If Jonathan catches wind of this, he'll do everything in his power to bury it. I nodded, my mind racing. What about a whistleblower? Someone on the inside who can corroborate the evidence? Marcus frowned. It's risky, but it might be our best shot. Do you know anyone who might be willing to talk? I thought for a moment, then it hit me. Jonathan's CFO, Sarah Bennett. She's been with him for years, but I've heard rumors that she's been unhappy lately. If we can convince her to come forward. Marcus's eyes lit up. That could work, but we'll need to approach her carefully. If she feels cornered, she might run to Jonathan. We spent the next few days planning our approach. Marcus used his connections to set up a meeting with Sarah, under the guise of a routine interview for an article he was writing. I stayed in the background, watching from a distance as Marcus worked his magic. The meeting took place at a quiet cafe downtown. Sarah arrived looking nervous, her eyes darting around the room as if she expected to be ambushed at any moment. Marcus greeted her warmly, putting her at ease with his easy charm. They talked for a while about her career, her work with Jonathan, and the challenges she faced as a woman in a male-dominated industry. Then, slowly, Marcus steered the conversation toward Jonathan's business practices. At first, Sarah was evasive, deflecting his questions with practiced ease. But as the conversation went on, her defenses began to crumble. Look, she said finally, her voice trembling. I don't know what you've heard, but I can't talk about this. If Jonathan finds out. He won't, Marcus said gently. We can protect you, but you need to help us. You need to do the right thing. Sarah hesitated, her eyes filling with tears. I've wanted to come forward for so long, but I was scared. He's not a good man. He'll destroy anyone who crosses him. Not this time, Marcus said firmly. This time, he's the one who's going down. It took some convincing, but eventually Sarah agreed to cooperate. She provided us with additional evidence, including emails, financial records, and recordings of conversations with Jonathan. It was more than enough to bring him to justice. With Sarah's help, we took the evidence to the FBI. They were shocked by the scope of Jonathan's crimes and immediately launched an investigation. Within weeks, Jonathan was arrested, his assets frozen, and his empire in ruins. The news of his arrest made headlines across the country. Jonathan Carter, the once untouchable real estate mogul, was now facing multiple charges of fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy. It was a spectacular fall from grace, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction as I watched his mugshot flash across the screen. But my satisfaction was short-lived. As the dust settled, I realized that while Jonathan had paid for his crimes, I still had to face the fallout of my own actions. I had set out to destroy him, and I had succeeded, but in the process, I had also destroyed a part of myself. I had become consumed by revenge, blinded by my anger and pain. I had pushed Emily away, refusing to forgive her, refusing to even try, and now, as I stood alone in my empty house, I couldn't help but wonder if I had made a mistake. The days following Jonathan's arrest were a blur. The media frenzy was relentless, and I found myself caught in the crossfire. Reporters called constantly, asking for comments, interviews, anything that could give them an edge in covering the scandal. I ignored them all. I had no interest in being part of the spectacle. My part in this was over. But even as I tried to move on, I couldn't escape the weight of what I had done. I had set out to destroy Jonathan, and I had succeeded. But at what cost? I had become so consumed by my desire for revenge that I had lost sight of everything else, my values, my relationships, even my own sense of self. I tried to distract myself with work, but it wasn't enough. The emptiness inside me was growing, and I didn't know how to fill it. I missed Emily. I missed the life we had built together, but I didn't know if I could ever forgive her. And even if I could, I didn't know if she would forgive me. One evening, as I was sitting on the porch with Max, my phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "We need to talk. Can you meet me at the bar?" I frowned. Marcus wasn't one for vague messages. "Sure," I replied. "What's going on?" "I'll explain when I see you." When I got to the bar, Marcus was already there, a serious expression on his face. He gestured for me to sit down, then slid a folder across the table. "What's this?" I asked, opening it. "It's about Emily," he said, his voice low. I froze, my heart racing. "What about her?" Marcus hesitated, then leaned in closer. "I've been doing some digging about her and Jonathan. I thought you should know." I felt a surge of anger. "Marcus, I told you to leave her out of this. She's been through enough." "Just read it," he said, his tone firm. I opened the folder, my hands trembling as I scanned the documents inside. What I saw made my blood run cold. Emily hadn't just been having an affair with Jonathan. She had been involved in his business dealings. She had helped him launder money, using her connections at the magazine to cover his tracks. She had known about his crimes, and she had kept quiet. I felt like I had been punched in the gut. All this time, I had thought she was just another victim of Jonathan's manipulation. But she wasn't. She had been complicit. I looked up at Marcus, my mind reeling. "How long have you known about this?" "Not long," he said, his voice tinged with regret. "I found out while I was digging into Jonathan's finances. I didn't want to believe it, but the evidence is there." "I'm sorry, Dan." I didn't know what to say. I felt betrayed, not just by Emily, but by myself. How could I have been so blind? How could I have loved someone who was capable of this? "What are you going to do?" Marcus asked. I shook my head, my thoughts a jumbled mess. "I don't know." Marcus reached across the table, placing a hand on my shoulder. "Whatever you decide, I've got your back. But you need to be careful. If this gets out, it could destroy her." I nodded, but I wasn't really listening. My mind was already racing, trying to process what I had just learned. Emily had lied to me. She had betrayed me in ways I couldn't even begin to understand. And now I had to decide what to do about it. I couldn't sleep that night. The revelation about Emily's involvement in Jonathan's crimes played on a loop in my mind. I felt sick, betrayed, and angry. Angry at her, at Jonathan, and at myself for not seeing the truth sooner. By morning, I had made a decision. I needed to confront her. I needed to hear the truth from her own lips. I drove to her apartment, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The city passed by in a blur, and before I knew it, I was standing outside her door, my heart pounding in my chest. I knocked, the sound echoing in the quiet hallway. It took a few moments, but eventually the door opened. Emily stood there, her eyes widening in surprise when she saw me. She looked tired, her hair pulled back into a messy bun, her face free of makeup. She was wearing an old sweatshirt and leggings, a far cry from the polished woman I had once known. "Dan," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What are you doing here?" "We need to talk," I said, my voice cold. "Now." She hesitated, then stepped aside to let me in. The apartment was small and cluttered, boxes stacked in the corners, the walls bare. It was a stark contrast to the home we had shared, and it only added to the ache in my chest. I turned to face her, my arms crossed over my chest. "I know, Emily." She frowned, confusion flickering across her face. "Know what?" "About Jonathan, about what you did." Her face went pale, and for a moment she didn't say anything. Then she sank onto the couch, her hands trembling. "Dan, I can explain." "Explain what?" I snapped, my anger boiling over. "How you helped him launder money, how you lied to me, how you betrayed me in every possible way." She flinched, tears welling up in her eyes. "It wasn't like that. I didn't know what he was doing at first. By the time I found out, it was too late. He had me in too deep." "And you didn't think to tell me?" I demanded, my voice rising. "You didn't think I had a right to know?" "I was scared," she said, her voice breaking. I didn't know what to do. I thought if I just kept quiet, it would all go away. I shook my head, disgusted. "You thought wrong, and now you're going to pay for it." She looked up at me, her eyes filled with fear. "What are you going to do?" I hesitated, the weight of my decision pressing down on me. I had the power to destroy her, just as I had destroyed Jonathan. But did I want to? Did I want to be that person? "I don't know," I said finally, my voice heavy with exhaustion. "But whatever happens, it's on you. You made your choices, Emily. Now you have to live with them." She started to cry, her shoulders shaking with sobs. "I'm so sorry, Dan. I never meant to hurt you. I never meant for any of this to happen." I wanted to believe her. I wanted to take her in my arms and tell her everything would be okay, but I couldn't. The trust was gone, shattered beyond repair. "I need to go," I said, turning toward the door. "Dan, wait," she called after me, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. I walked out of her apartment and into the hallway, my mind racing. As I drove home, I realized that I had a choice to make. I could expose Emily's involvement in Jonathan's crimes, ensuring that she faced the consequences of her actions. Or I could walk away, leaving her to deal with the fallout on her own. But as much as I wanted to see her pay, I knew that I couldn't do it. I couldn't let my desire for revenge consume me any further. I had already lost too much. The days that followed were some of the hardest of my life. I felt like I was standing at a crossroads, torn between the desire for justice and the need to move on. I had spent so long consumed by anger and revenge that I didn't know how to let it go. But I knew I had to try. I decided to focus on rebuilding my life, one step at a time. I started by reconnecting with the things that had once brought me joy, my work, my friends, my hobbies. I threw myself into a new project at work, designing a community center for a struggling neighborhood. It was challenging, but it gave me a sense of purpose, a reminder of why I had become an architect in the first place. I also started seeing a therapist. At first, I was hesitant. I had always been the kind of person who kept my emotions bottled up, but I realized that if I was ever going to heal, I needed to confront the pain I had been carrying. It wasn't easy, but slowly I began to make progress. Meanwhile, Emily's life continued to spiral. Without Jonathan's protection, she was exposed to the full consequences of her actions. She lost her job, her reputation was in tatters, and she was facing legal trouble of her own. I heard through the grapevine that she had moved back to her hometown, trying to start over. Part of me felt sorry for her, but I knew that she had brought it on herself. One evening, as I was sitting on the porch with Max, my phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "You free tonight? There's something I want to talk to you about." I frowned. Marcus wasn't one for vague messages. "Sure," I replied. "What's up?" I'll explain when I see you. Meet me at the usual spot at 8. When I got to the bar, Marcus was already there, a serious expression on his face. He gestured for me to sit down, then slid a folder across the table. "What's this?" I asked, opening it. "It's about Emily," he said, his voice low. I froze, my heart racing. "What about her?" Marcus hesitated, then leaned in closer. "I've been doing some digging. About her and Jonathan. I thought you should know." I felt a surge of anger. "Marcus, I told you to leave her out of this. She's been through enough." "Just read it," he said, his tone firm. I opened the folder, my hands trembling as I scanned the documents inside. What I saw made my blood run cold. Emily hadn't just been having an affair with Jonathan. She had been involved in his business dealings. She had helped him launder money, using her connections at the magazine to cover his tracks. She had known about his crimes, and she had kept quiet. I felt like I had been punched in the gut. All this time, I had thought she was just another victim of Jonathan's manipulation. But she wasn't. She had been complicit. I looked up at Marcus, my mind reeling. "How long have you known about this?" "Not long," he said, his voice tinged with regret. "I found out while I was digging into Jonathan's finances. I didn't want to believe it, but the evidence is there. I'm sorry, Dan." I didn't know what to say. I felt betrayed, not just by Emily, but by myself. How could I have been so blind? How could I have loved someone who was capable of this? "What are you going to do?" Marcus asked. I shook my head, my thoughts a jumbled mess. "I don't know." Marcus reached across the table, placing a hand on my shoulder. "Whatever you decide, I've got your back. But you need to be careful. If this gets out, it could destroy her." I nodded, but I wasn't really listening. My mind was already racing, trying to process what I had just learned. Emily had lied to me. She had betrayed me in ways I couldn't even begin to understand. And now, I had to decide what to do about it. The weight of what I had learned about Emily sat heavily on my shoulders. For days, I wrestled with the decision of what to do. The evidence Marcus had given me was enough to bring her down, to ensure she faced the consequences of her actions. But as much as I wanted justice, I couldn't bring myself to destroy her completely. I had already lost so much to anger and revenge. I didn't want to lose myself in the process. Instead, I decided to confront her one last time, not to punish her, but to find closure. I needed to see her face, to hear her voice, to understand how the woman I had loved could have become someone capable of such betrayal. I drove to her hometown, a small town in the Midwest where she had grown up. It was a quiet place, far removed from the chaos of the city. I found her living in a modest house on the edge of town, surrounded by fields and trees. She looked different, softer, more vulnerable. The polished facade she had worn in the city was gone, replaced by a raw, unfiltered version of herself. When she opened the door and saw me, her eyes widened in shock. "Dan," she whispered, her voice trembling, "what are you doing here?" "We need to talk," I said, my voice steady but not unkind. She hesitated, then stepped aside to let me in. The house was simple but cozy, filled with books and photographs. It was a far cry from the life we had shared, but it felt authentic, like she was finally being true to herself. We sat across from each other at her kitchen table, the silence between us heavy with unspoken words. Finally, I broke the silence. "I know everything, Emily," I said, my voice calm but firm. "About Jonathan, about what you did." She flinched, her eyes filling with tears. "Dan, I'm so sorry. I never wanted to hurt you. I was lost." "You were more than lost," I said, my voice rising slightly. "You were complicit. You helped him, Emily. You knew what he was doing and you did nothing to stop it." She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I know, and I'll regret it for the rest of my life. But I was scared. I didn't know how to get out. By the time I realized how deep I was, it was too late." I took a deep breath, trying to steady my emotions. "Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you trust me?" She looked down at her hands, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was ashamed. I didn't want you to see me like that. I didn't want to lose you." "You lost me anyway," I said, my voice heavy with sadness. "And you lost yourself in the process. She nodded, her tears falling freely now. I know, and I don't expect you to forgive me. I just want you to know that I'm sorry for everything. I sat there for a long time, watching her cry, feeling the weight of everything we had lost. And then, slowly, I reached across the table and took her hand. I don't know if I can forgive you, I said, my voice soft, but I don't want to hate you either. I want to move on, and I want you to move on too. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and despair. What are you going to do? I'm not going to expose you, I said, my voice firm, but you need to come clean. You need to take responsibility for what you've done. If you don't, it will destroy you. She nodded, her grip on my hand tightening. I will, I promise. We sat there for a while longer, talking about the past, about the mistakes we had made, and about the future. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. By the time I left, I felt a sense of closure, a weight lifted from my shoulders. As I drove back to the city, I realized that I had finally let go of the anger and pain that had consumed me for so long. I had faced the truth, confronted my demons, and come out the other side. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful. Emily's life took a different path. She turned herself in, cooperating with the authorities and facing the consequences of her actions. It wasn't easy, but it was the first step toward redemption. She lost everything, her career, her reputation, her freedom, but in the process she found herself. As for me, I continued to rebuild my life. I threw myself into my work, finding joy in the projects I took on and the people I worked with. I reconnected with old friends and made new ones, building a support system that helped me through the tough times. And slowly, I began to open myself up to the possibility of love again. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't perfect, but it was real. And that was enough.